The world famous artist Damien Hirst once described the 9/11 attacks as an incredible work of art. He later retracted that statement. He was forced to apologize basically the next day. But the rationale that he gave was that the 9/11 attacks forced us to see the world in a new way. And, he was probably right about that. I think the reason he got a lot of pushback is because, as we've talked about on the pod before, most people are inclined to see art as an inherently good thing. And so they heard him say this terror attack is a work of art, and they heard it as if he had said this terror attack was something good. Here on Bad Art, we're not hampered by that way of thinking. Uh,
We don't think that art is good.
no, we don't. So we can think that the 9/11 attack was both a work of art and a bad thing. Um, and I at least would agree that it did change our way of seeing the world. If you think about the war on terror, a lot of what you think about is images and visual spectacle. So I think of, Bush and Giuliani with the firefighters in Manhattan. I think of the toppling of Saddam's statue as US troops entered Baghdad. I think of the images of torture coming out of Abu Ghraib. I think of Bush on the aircraft carrier with the mission accomplished banner before him several years before the war would actually end. Um,
Like a decade, more than
More
a
than a
decade
decade, more
before.
than a decade. A little overconfident, perhaps. But all of these images were part of a deliberate project to promote the war on terror through a visual medium of communicating to Americans and getting Americans to buy into this as sort of a natural and appropriate thing. And so what we want to look at today is the way that the war on terror was aesthetically productive, how it shaped new ways of seeing the world, and what impacts that aesthetic production had on our political life. And we're going to look at this on two ways. First, we want to look stateside at the ways that the war on terror was in many ways an aesthetic project within the United States. But at the same time, we also wanted to look at the way that the war on terror in the countries that it was fought was a work of art in the Damien Hirst sense, that it was a terrible thing that upended the ways that people looked at the world around them. The other thing to note is that as we began working on this episode, it became a pretty big topic. And so we wanted to break it up. Today's episode is about the aesthetics of the war on terror itself. And then we're going to have a follow-up episode that looks more closely at efforts to memorialize the 9/11 attack and the memorial site for 9/11 and contestation over that. With that in mind, welcome to Bad Art's episode about the war on terror. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock,
I'm your other host, Marielle Grushko.
and you're listening to Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast. In preparation for the episode, I was looking at this. I think it's a new book. Looking at this book, Insurgent Aesthetics by Ronak Kapadia, which looks at how artists respond to the drone war. Most of the book, I think, is interesting, but not necessarily useful for our purposes. But in the introduction, it has this quote, which you may have heard before, but there's a young Afghani boy who testified to Congress about the experience of a drone strike which killed members of his family. And he has this quote, which I've heard in other places. I no longer love blue skies. In fact, I now prefer gray skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are gray. When the sky brightens and becomes blue, the drone returns, and so does the fear. And then Kapadia, the author, continues, the poisoned air, the buzzing sounds, the deadly hellfire pouring down from above, the earth rattling beneath their feet, and the interminable waiting, the absolute indeterminacy and lack of syncopation that breaks the rhythm and beats of everyday lives, all collide and collude in crafting a new U.S. global imperial sensorium. And that really struck with me, like this idea of a new U.S. global sensorium as something we could think about in this episode. Where Kapadia goes with that is to talk about artists who we may know. So Wafa Bilal, who did this installation where people could go on the internet and shoot him with rubber bullets. So he was on screen for a long period of time. Just people could go and shoot an Afghan with bullets. Or Larissa Sansor, who made a virtual Palestine in space as a sort of way of escaping the war on terror.
Mm.
These are interesting projects in what they reveal about the impacts of the war on terror. But I mean, I think we wanted to look at the war on terror itself a little bit more.
I think what I am hearing in what you're telling me about, though, is kind of there's two ways, or maybe not, right? But this is just what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
is that when we talk about the war on terror as an aesthetic event or as inaugurating a new type of war aesthetic, we really are talking about two different things,
Yes.
right? One of which is for people living in theaters of warfare as defined by the war on terror. You know, the acts, like not actually the axis of evil, though, although that's what people actually just Muslims.
Right. The drone
Um,
war took place in like 27 countries or something like that. So,
right, right.
yeah.
So that wider field of operations that comes from the Bush administration's definition of the war on terror as a civilizational war, pitting Western Christianity against Islam. So there's a version of war on terror aesthetics that is those aesthetics as experienced by people living in that field of operations, right?
Right.
War operations, drone operations. And then there's also the field of aesthetics as experienced by Americans watching their government prosecute this war on terror. And I think my question is, do you consider those to be two separate aesthetics, or are they the same? And like that's part of how that sameness operates through that bifurcation.
Yeah. Your comment right there did an excellent job of like laying out what I was hoping this quote would get us to, which is that there is this divided sensorium, right? Like that there is like a space in the theater of operations where people are experiencing the war on terror very differently from how it was experienced in the US. But in both places, it was experienced as an aesthetic event, albeit of different kinds. And as we've said, we're both anthropologists. Reading this quote, I was thinking a lot about the history of anthroaesthetics, and which is simply, the idea that people see the world in different ways, like that our perception is not universal. So
Right. So not see the world in different ways, as in the metaphor of seeing, but that we literally see with our eyes different worlds.
yeah, so it's a response to the sort of Enlightenment idea that in Enlightenment aesthetics, the first thing that everyone has in common is that we all look out and see the world. And then everything else may vary, but there's a universal human experience of aesthetics, of vision. And what anthroaesthetics does is say, well, actually, that's not true because people don't have the same preeminent, like first-hand experience of vision. And the way they showed this, one of the first things was to take like theories of language and say, if you have 20 words for the color green, you're going to see more gradations in green than you are in someone who only has one word for green.
And cognitive anthropologists, for instance, would do categorization experiments with people from different societies where they would hand them basically a stack of paint chips of different colors and ask them to sort them, right? And
Right,
see, how many different piles would they make from these gradations of colors.
right. And another similar thing is if you're walking through the woods and the only word you have is plant or shrub and tree. Like you're going to see the woods very differently than if you're someone who's been trained to know the names of all the different plants and to recognize them as having uses. So you walk through and see a story of the forest as opposed to someone who just sees a forest. And so anthroaesthetics goes from there to be like, people have like really starkly different categories. You can say, oh yeah, I still see the animal, I just don't know what it's named, or I still see the tree, I don't know what it's named. But What's inside and outside varies from culture to culture. What's naked, what's clothed varies from culture to culture. Like so these categories of seeing, which are really important to how we see things. What's time, right? Because we see things moving, but what's time? That varies from culture to culture. So our sight, which is assumed by Enlightenment aestheticians to be universal, is culturally conditioned first, and then we see, right? So aesthetics comes after culture, according to anthroaesthetics. And to read that back into this quote that we opened with, like there's a cultural shaping of the ways that people see the world, which is being divided by the war on terror, right? That on the one hand, people have to learn to recognize drones, to be able to hear the sound of a drone coming up behind them, to be able to know that blue skies mean, violence is possible. And on the other hand, you have a very different world taking shape in the US where a lot of that's invisible or has been kept out of view.
And the other thing that I understood from the quote that you read is that it's not just that people who live in the operating theater of the war on terror, or I don't know if operating theater is the right word, but people who live within that space, it's not just that they become able to see and hear drones when before the war on terror, there was obviously no need to do that. It's also that even in a sky where drones are absent, their way of seeing that sky has been
Yeah.
forever changed.
Yeah.
And even if all of the drone wars that grew out of the war on terror and that continue to this day were to end and never resume, those ways of seeing that were conditioned
Yeah.
by drone warfare are potentially at least here to stay.
Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking about it, I was thinking in the US, there's an effort to create a field of vision that is, on the one hand, doesn't see what we're doing, but on the other hand, is uniform, to see a kind of unity in response to terror that encircles the United States, whereas the impact and perhaps purpose of the war was to fracture reality in the places where the war was practiced. So there's a fracturing of experience, a creation of instability on the one hand, and a creation of imagined stability and strength on the other hand.
Hmm. That's really interesting.
So, yeah, starting in the United States, if we ask this question, what is the sensorium that gets cultivated by the war on terror? One of the things I thought of immediately was the security campaign from the early war on terror, where they told you if you see something, say something. So there was a pervasive campaign on the New York City subway, in airports. There were public safety ads that would say, if you see something, say something. It would be like a picture of a backpack laying somewhere. And they wanted to encourage all people in the US to constantly keep an eye out for things that might be signs of terrorist activity.
Part of what that's doing is inculcating a specific way of seeing into
Yeah,
Americans that one, when we look around us, we should specifically be alert to threats in our visual field. But two, a redefinition of what is a threat in the visual field, right? So they're not saying if you see a knife wielding madman, say
right,
something. The reason for the need to say something is because what you are supposed to be doing, according to these PSAs, was to read the threat in your innocent surroundings.
right. There's a classic 30 Rock episode where the protagonist Liz Lemon has a new Muslim neighbor and she begins to be concerned that he's planning a terror attack. And the reason she's concerned is like she sees maps in his apartment. She sees him like doing an obstacle course on the playground. There's some other things. And so she sees if you see something, say something billboard and phones him into the police and he gets disappeared. And meanwhile, the thing that he was actually doing was preparing to compete on the Amazing Race reality show. But it is this idea that we're supposed to be able to recognize, like, what are signs that a terrorist attack is being planned?
Right.
And what people recognize is, oh, here's a person who looks different from me, right? Oh, there's a hijab that might be threatening. So these sorts of things encourage Americans to view their fellow citizens as potential threats and to begin investigating them, to be part of the police force that is keeping their fellow citizens contained.
I mean, I'm just thinking about the deputization of every American as junior partners in the war on terror is the other thing that comes through really clearly in that if you see something, say something campaign. We are all part of fighting the war on terror.
Yeah, and thinking about its impacts, I know I mentioned this on a previous episode, but this really amazing there's this really amazing article called Dogma Line Racism by Liram Medavoy, which is an analysis of Nazi propaganda read through the War on Terror. And so I did mention this in a previous episode, but one of the things that he points out is that Nazis were very concerned in Germany that anybody could be Jewish, right? You can't actually see them if they're not wearing clothes that mark them as Jewish because they were ethnically basically German. And the propaganda film that he shares to begin this article is called Der Ehrwig Jude. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right, but it shows a Jewish guy in, a classical Jewish outfit with, an Orthodox hat. And then he takes it off and he just looks German. And the message of the film is like, this guy could be hiding among us. So you need to help us find where he is. And then Medavoy immediately shifts to the television of the War on Terror period, where there are always evil Muslims hiding among us. He doesn't make this example, but one of the classic examples is Homeland, right? Where a a soldier who has been abroad, like who was a prisoner of war, has escaped, has returned home, but secretly he's now converted to Islam and is on a mission to stage a dramatic terror attack in the U.S. So that idea that anyone could be hiding anywhere is at the center of this, and then it creates this need. We need to investigate. We need to find out where the Muslims are. We need to find out where the Jews are. And that sort of technology is what's mobilized by this way of looking at the world. It turns people into investigators and mobilizes a police against them.
And in the case of the war on terror ideology about hidden terrorists, it's not just that any Muslim person could be a terrorist. It's also, as I think the Homeland storyline dramatizes, I haven't seen it, but if I'm understanding it correctly, part of the point there is that any Muslim could become a terrorist because any Muslim could be radicalized. And
Right,
that can happen abroad or it could happen at your local mosque, right? So this is
right.
the same period of time where the FBI is operating domestically and entrapping Muslims, right? Setting up
Yeah,
like little fake terroristic plots for them to quote unquote participate in. That what was it, the Newburgh Three, right? Went to jail for more than a decade
yep,
because of a plot that was entirely made up by FBI handlers.
right, right. So all of this is like facilitating that sort of violence towards American Muslims or people who might be American Muslims, like as Jasper Poir points out, like a lot of this got directed towards Sikhs, right? Because Americans can't tell the difference. And so, yeah, there's just like a proliferation of violence, a proliferation of suspicion and policing. Yeah,
To sort of double down on our earlier point, the bifurcation of this spectacle is that there's this proliferation of violence and surveillance for Muslims in the United States, where every Muslim person feels this oppressive environment and this suspicion.
right.
And at the same time, the other side of that bifurcation, for Americans who are not Muslim, we are supposed to look at the people around us with suspicion.
Yeah. This is slightly different, but to give an idea of how far this spread, my first job out of college was as a reporter in a small town. So I worked for the Medina Journal Register in upstate New York. It's in farm country. There's literally nothing there. And early on, I reported on the appointment of Orleans County's first counterterrorism czar, which there was like fund money from the Bush administration to set up someone who was responsible for coordinating the county's terrorism response in case there was ever a terror attack in this county, where there were less than 100,000 people,
On the cows.
right? Like it was just there's nothing there. And it, she made the case. I went and met her and interviewed her, and she's like, well, we could use this for, suppose there was a sickness, right? We could use this for something that's not actually a terror attack. But there was still like this effort to convince Americans that a terror attack was imminent wherever you were. And this myth of preparedness, this myth of you are responsible for keeping us prepared, kept a lot of people in a state of alert and changed their way of looking at the world around them.
Yes. I remember, for instance, I mean, I grew up about 100 miles north of New York City. So while there were people who lived in my community who were in the towers on 9/11, and certainly like we were in commuting distance, and so people were affected, but no one was going to come and bomb Poughkeepsie, New York.
Right.
However, I remember being extremely aware that we lived about 40 miles away from an active nuclear power plant and being very concerned and, trying to research what is the radius of nuclear
Oh
fallout.
no.
If the terrorists were to bomb the nuclear power plant, would my home be in the fallout radius?
That kind of fear is just so aggressively.
And in my defense, I was a child,
Right.
but it speaks to the climate of fear and suspicion and paranoia.
So the other thing that we wanted to talk about with regard to the US was the Bush administration's effort to stage manage the war itself, to really self-consciously manage the media, manage the way that the war was presented and seen by audiences in the US, and especially to restrict media access in ways that aligned with the Bush administration's vision. And to understand this, it's important to know a few things about the neoconservative movement in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, and the way that they were reacting to what they perceived as the failures of the US in Vietnam, which Republicans and many other people blamed on the news. Many conservatives believe that Vietnam was lost because Americans saw it on TV.
And I think a lot of liberals at the time of the War on Terror also believed that. I
Yeah,
remember a lot of um, one of the liberal critiques of the media at the time of the War on Terror was that the media wasn't showing photos of the coffins of American service members being returned from the war. I think liberals believed that if photos of the US dead were seen coming back from Iraq and
yeah,
Afghanistan, that would be the thing to create the moral outcry to end the war.
right. So the story that often gets told is that the US lost Vietnam because Americans saw what was happening over there and didn't have the stomach for what needed to be done to win the war against communism. And if the news just hadn't been there, we could have killed a lot more people and we wouldn't have had a conscience about it and we'd have gotten it over it and we'd have won. That's a very popular story in the 1980s and 90s among the neoconservatives.
And a very bizarre story, I might
Right.
add, in the sense that the military quagmire that the US had founded itself in, that was a real military quagmire, right? It
Right.
wasn't just the mediation of that quagmire to the voting public at home. That was the reality on the ground, is that they could not win this war, or at least not easily.
No, we got our asses kicked by a well-organized guerrilla army that had popular support against an invading imperial army.
Yeah,
Um,
tough to overcome that, even if it's not airing on TV.
Even if you have a lot more money and many better weapons and are firebombing the entire countryside, killing
Right.
everything that's there.
Is the implication to this neoconservative theory of how they could have won the Vietnam War, is the implication that had the war not been mediated to the public, they would have basically committed more war crimes and won
Yeah.
it in that way?
No, I mean pretty explicitly that
Okay.
they were held back by the public's conscience, which in their view was wrong because what needed to be done was to defeat communism in Vietnam.
So it's specifically the public's conscience when it comes to Vietnamese civilians, not so much the public's consciousness when it comes to US troops.
Both. But there was a like the My Lai massacre, like Agent Orange. There was an awareness that the things that the US military was doing over there were horrible. But there was also the visual spectacle of American death. So both of those things together were things that conservatives subsequently wanted to hide from the American public because they felt that that sapped our willingness to fight the wars that they wanted to fight.
And of course, a less generous way of putting their argument would be to say that what they had a problem with were the moral standards of the public,
Yeah.
that they wanted permission to prosecute this war in as immoral a way as they would have wanted to be accountable to no one but themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that happens again through the right is that the next several years are spent sort of relitigating the Vietnam War in American media. So you have not the first Rambo movie, but the sequels to Rambo, where he goes to Vietnam and just kills a lot of people because supposedly there are Americans left behind. You have the prisoner of war, missing in action flag and popular movement, which is, conservatively funded and supported, aiming to, again, drive like a continued militaristic stance towards Vietnam because there are soldiers who didn't come back. And obviously that's, proof of duplicity on Vietnam's part, not proof of the incredible death toll and the fact that not everyone's body was recovered. So there's a lot of work to kind of mobilize this idea that we should have fought longer and harder to not leave anybody behind and so on.
Yeah, no, I guess I'm just thinking about I grew up in the 90s, as did you, and media about the Vietnam War, from what I remember of my childhood, was pretty much omnipresent. There
Yeah.
was always some new movie or book or documentary TV series or what have you thinking about that war from a conservative perspective, from a liberal perspective as well, right? But that war was not understood to be over until 9/11. Like it really
Yeah.
did just feel like the politics of even the 1990s were still relitigating elements of the Vietnam War. And even actually, even up to the 2004 election, right? You have the Swift boat veterans for truth are tearing John Kerry down, alleging that his record of service during the Vietnam War was falsified. At the same time, you have the Democrats calling out that George W. Bush didn't serve in Vietnam, right? So even in the War on Terror era, there's still this huge amount of concern with the Vietnam War, and it remains very much alive as I would argue more than merely a ghost.
Yeah, I would agree. The trauma kept getting recirculated
Hmm.
as the Vietnam War was a national catastrophe, right? And the neoconservatives are, trying, many of whom, helped to prosecute the Vietnam War, are trying to figure out how to recover from this. And one of their answers is the first invasion of Iraq. So in 1991, after the end of the Iran-Iraq War, where Iraq had fought a long, costly war on the US's behalf, Iraq said, we want to make up some of our losses. We're going to invade Kuwait and take their oil. So Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the first Bush administration, so Bush Sr., invaded Kuwait to take it back from Iraq. But for the neoconservatives, this was important because it was a very easy war to win, and they could do it on TV. So they really stage managed everything, showcasing their military superiority. Everything was videoed from afar in ways that were controlled by the military. And when it was over, one of the things that the military leaders said was the Vietnam syndrome's finally kicked. We've gotten over our sense of incompetence or inferiority. We now can go ahead and prosecute wars in the future. So they were really careful to present an easily winnable war as a spectacle of American resurgence, the renewal of American military capacity, and then that carries forward into George Bush Jr.'s invasion of Iraq.
Can we, before we go into the
Yeah.
ways that it carries forward, can we say two more things?
Yes.
Um, okay, so if I'm not mistaken, the first Gulf War has the distinction of being the first US war that was shown live on TV
Yeah.
as it was happening. So that was the big innovation, for lack of a better word, when you think about the way in which this war was mediated. Because certainly there had been wars throughout the 20th century where the US government exerted pretty tight control over the media images of that war in a propagandistic way. That's not new, although it is important. But the novelty of the first Gulf War is that all of this was playing out live on Americans' television screens. And so that was considered a big PR win at the time for the Bush administration, that it was able to show what looked to people like an unmediated reality of their total air dominance in this very short, easy to win war. So that's one thing that's innovative. And you should imagine like air quotes around the word
Right.
innovative. The other thing that's interesting about the first Gulf War is that it is credited with having launched the 24-hour news cycle.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so the story here is that CNN was not one of the major news networks prior to the first Gulf War. And during this, again, very short war, where there was live footage available, CNN responded to that set of circumstances by basically clearing out all their other programming and just showing and commenting on the war live as it was happening. And it was innovative in that it created a new model for covering the news, which was wall to wall, 24-hour coverage. Events don't go to bed at night and wake up the next morning for the next print edition of the newspaper. Events keep happening on TV. So this is credited with launching the 24-hour news cycle. So I think
Yeah.
this is an important history for us to consider. This launch of the 24-hour news cycle is part and parcel of the way that the war on terror ends up developing about a decade later.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to note here is this interesting quote from the French situationist Jean Baudrillard, who says that the Gulf War did not take place at all. He wrote this famous essay called "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place," basically on the presumption that it was entirely a staged managed piece of spectacular theater rather than an actual war with actual stakes. And that the goal of the event was to create the spectacle, not any military goals that may or may not have been achieved. And that certainly a piece of that that's definitely true for Bush Sr.'s office, that they want to create a spectacle which creates this buy-in. Again, after the first Gulf War, Bush Sr. says, we've finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. We're free to wage war again.
And just to point out, part of what made it so easy for the first Gulf War to be stage managed was that it was short.
Was that it was short, and also that, yeah, it was short. It was preordained, and also you have this condition where a lot of the war is being fought at a degree of remove so that the press can be managed because there's not a lot of ground conflict. So the same advisors from Bush Sr. are in Bush Jr.'s cabinet, or at least some of the same advisors. And when they decide to invade Iraq, when they decide to invade Iraq, they attempt to recreate this sense of media control. So one of the things they do is they have a staging center where media are based, and a lot of the news coverage comes from direct reports given by Pentagon spokespeople to reporters in this briefing room. And when they went out into the field, they went with soldiers. So there was a very strong effort to contain what reporters saw and how they reported on it, and to get them to report on the war as if it was a high-tech spectacle. So to report on the technology that the Department of Defense was using to bomb Iraq, to report on the planning, to report on the sophistication of the war effort, to report on the spectacle of might, and also not to show the devastation, both of the death of U.S. soldiers, but also especially of the damage that we were causing in Iraq itself.
I'm curious to know, you said in the first Gulf War, the press was at a remove. I know that one of the changes with the war on terror was press being embedded in military units. Was that something that was planned from the outset of these wars as part of a way of communicating the technological advancement of the US military? Or was that a later fix when the wars didn't end as quickly as had been hoped for to continue the stage management of the spectacle?
I think that was planned from the beginning, and part of it was to not only show the technological advancement, but also to compel the reporters to identify with the perspective of the American military, right? So the news was reported very much from a soldier's point of view, as opposed to a bystander. Like there's not a neutral perspective, or reporters are much more mobile in Vietnam on their own to gather information independently and often come up with information that contradicted what they were being told by the military. In Iraq, they did not do that as effectively because the Department of Defense had put such an emphasis on controlling the way the news was produced and distributed.
And, thinking again about, I'm sort of trying to think with the anti-war movement in the 2000s against the war on terror as one possible way of gauging the effectiveness of this aesthetic transformation.
Hmm.
Because we've been saying it's not just that the war was an aesthetic spectacle, it's also that it crafted brand new ways of seeing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm trying to think with the anti-war movement as a way of gauging the effectiveness of the crafting of those new ways of seeing. Because if even the anti-war folks in the US adopted these new ways of seeing, then we could say, yes, this transformation really did happen. And so I guess what I'm thinking about, to your point about how the embedded reporters were really encouraging this identification with the soldiers in how the war was reported and how the war was understood by the public at home. A lot of the anti-war messaging, particularly as the war ground on, centered around the needs of the troops, right?
Right.
That the troops didn't have the correct or sufficient body armor, for instance, I remember was a big, big deal. And so that makes me think, wow, this really worked, right? Even the anti-war movement was primarily concerned with the soldiers' perspective on the war rather than the victims of the warfare.
Yeah. Support the troops, bring them home. But one of the curious things is that despite this effort to embed reporters, control their access, give stage managed access to Department of Defense spokespeople, they don't actually have control over everyone. And one of the parallel things that happens, one of the parallel things that happens at this time is you have the start of the news network known as Al Jazeera, which is covering these events from a very different perspective, getting Arab perspectives on the war, and particularly getting perspectives from inside Iraq, where people have been harmed by the U.S. invasion. So they're showing the catastrophic impacts of U.S. bomb blasts. They're also showing Iraqi insurgents fighting against American soldiers, kidnapping American soldiers, executing American soldiers. So there is an image of the war very different from what Rumsfeld and Bush want to put out there that's circulating in the Arab world. And you can see it in the US, but it's circulating less because there's a lot of restrictions on how Al Jazeera reaches American audiences. And so this leads Rumsfeld to begin talking about Al Jazeera as if it is part of the the axis of evil, as if it is one of the terrorist organizations that are threatening the United States. And so this is Rumsfeld talking about Al Jazeera.
We know that Al Jazeera has a pattern of playing propaganda over and over and over again. What they do is when there's a bomb goes down, they grab some children and some women and pretend that the bomb hit the women and the children. And it seems to me that it's up to all of us to try to tell the truth, to say what we know, to say what we don't know, and recognize that we're dealing with people that are perfectly willing to lie to the world to attempt to further their case. And to the extent people lie, ultimately they are caught lying and they lose their credibility. And one would think it wouldn't take very long for that to happen dealing with people like this.
So, yeah, I mean, I had never seen that clip of Rumsfeld before. And it is astonishing to watch him stand there and tell these journalists it's Al Jazeera that's lying, that they are cynically posing civilians in the rubble to make it look as though the US has bombed their homes, right? And then immediately after he says that, he says something about how we don't know what has actually happened. So he wants us to think that he's issuing a strong denial, saying this did not happen. And Al Jazeera is trying to create an alternative reality where the US bombs civilians, but it's a lie. But he can't bring himself to tell that lie with his whole chest. He then immediately pivots to this kind of denial of US responsibility for what has happened.
The other thing that really stands out to me is like, what is it that Al Jazeera is doing? They're showing images of women and children who have been hit by US bombs. And that's an offense against the United States, right? Like this is threatening the United States, threatening the war effort to show what we now know and we knew then are the facts of the invasion. That that people die when you bomb them and people get injured when you bomb them, and it's horrible. And the fact that these images were circulating is treated as a danger to the US and as, contributing to the terror effort because people are seeing these. It's, quote, propaganda. It's mobilizing Iraqis to resist the US invasion. Again, this perception, if they didn't see what we did, everything would be fine. But they see it, and now they're mad, and now they're fighting back, and Al Jazeera is promoting terror, promoting insurgency, right? That's the story that they tell. And then they begin calling Al Jazeera, Al Qaeda news.
Before we go to Al Qaeda news, you also can hear that in the moment where Rumsfeld says that they're playing and replaying the same footage over and over and over again,
Yeah.
right? As if the United States were not at this period, at this exact moment in time, as if US media were not playing and replaying the same footage over and over again to get a rise out of Americans, to provoke them into nationalist sentiments. Of course, that's exactly what was happening. And so the problem with Al Jazeera doing the same thing, playing and replaying images of harm coming, in this case, to Iraqis rather than to Americans, is that it's an inversion of the rightful order of the world, right? Only the United States should have such authority to play and replay images of harm. If someone else does it, well, that's propaganda.
Right. And of course, I mean, that's exactly what the 24-hour news cycle is, right? It's like you replay the same clips over and over again because stuff doesn't actually happen that fast. But there's a sense to create urgency. You have to continue showing stories. And yeah, so Rumsfeld responds and Bush responds by beginning to call Al Jazeera Al Qaeda news. And then one of the predictable things that happens is that they eventually bomb a building that Al Jazeera is using to broadcast from in Baghdad. And Al Jazeera reported Tariq Ayoub was killed in that bombing. So, and it appears to be a targeted strike on Al Jazeera based on this Bush effort to stop Al Jazeera from showing what is actually happening inside Iraq. And, I can't, like, we're talking about this event in the past, the murder of Ayoub, but I can't tell this story without thinking about what's happening today in Gaza, right? That the repeated murder of journalists whose crime is, again, that they are showing what is happening inside Gaza And that is treated by Israel and the US as terrorist incitement. That showing the fact of death is a crime against the stronger country, which is doing the killing, becomes part of the war on terror and part of the image management of the war on terror.
Yeah, I am wondering if I can pull up the Committee to Protect Journalists statistics on journalists and media workers killed since 1992. This is according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And we'll put the link to this chart in the show notes. There are a lot of different interesting ways that you can break down this data set and look more closely at specific items within the data set. But a pattern that you can see is that more journalists are killed in 2001, fewer in 2002, and then it just skyrockets, decreases 2019 to 2022. And then, of course, as we all know, skyrockets from 2023. And so I done a deep dive into these numbers, right? But you can see this periodization of journalist and media workers' deaths that seems to map pretty clearly to the peak years of the war on terror and seems to be mapping once again to Israel's invasion of Gaza.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure there are statistics that are even more precise, fine-grained on like just how many journalists have been killed in Gaza relative to other, but it is one of the least safe places to be a journalist ever. And the reason for that is because they're being targeted because they are sharing images of what's happening, which is seen as disrupting the reality that the military aggressor wants to construct.
And another thing that I would add about the murder of journalists in Gaza is that there too we've seen targeted strikes by Israel to media workers. And this is something that unfortunately the US's prosecution of the war on terror really laid the groundwork for, right? Targeted strikes against media buildings start out sort of as an assertion of power by the United States, where, yes, there is supposedly this rules-based international order that the United States is fostering around the world. And yet, of course, the US is exempt from that rules-based international order at every stage of the war on terror, right? Because it's the only superpower. But what we have seen more recently is the breakdown of that ostensibly rules-based international order, where in a lot of ways the US has given Israel license to act
Yeah.
as the US itself would have in a similar situation, and as the US did do in a similar situation.
Yeah. So I think that leads really strongly into talking about what the US is doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, one of the things that they're doing is bombing and destroying a whole lot of stuff. So obviously you have the famous toppling of the Saddam statue, which is sort of a staged event where as the US military enters, some Iraqis who most Arabic speakers do not think are from the area where this is.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they think they're gotten somewhere else, brought along, and put there by the U.S. to stage this toppling of Saddam and then to tell interviewers, oh, we're so excited that Saddam is gone. So this is like a stage managed event.
They're astroturfed outside agitators.
Yeah, they're astroturfed to give the impression that the U.S. invaders are being welcomed when they aren't really being welcomed. I mean, this is an aside, but a curious thing about that, like so much of the Islamophobia of that period is about iconoclasm, right? Is about the Taliban in Afghanistan destroying these giant stone Buddhist landmarks. So there's this idea that, Muslims destroy images. And that's one of the reasons why we need to invade and, teach them democracy. But we go in and we destroy images as well. And I think,
And there's also I remember from this time period, there's a lot in the US media about the efforts to preserve the archaeological treasures from Iraqi museums, which I know we're going to get into later. No,
Well, no, but you're incorrect. We are going to get into that later, but there's
I'm
not an effort to
incorrect.
preserve it. There's no effort to
Oh,
preserve it. No, the thing that happens is that the U.S. does not guard the Iraqi National Museum and allows it to be looted. So they come in, they don't provide any
oh,
protection, and the Iraqi National Museum, which is
that's like
uh,
such a, a lost opportunity for the US to do some good propaganda there. You would think they would have wanted to.
yeah, no, they did the opposite because people got really mad, like, why aren't you protecting our heritage? And the US allowed a lot of Iraq's architectural heritage to be destroyed. And just to say, I think many listeners will know this, but Iraq is in the Fertile Crescent. It is the birthplace of civilization, as we say. So there are irreplaceable treasures from the history of humanity that Iraqis are very proud of being descended from. You know what I mean? And to have that heritage destroyed and desecrated by the invading force is a real insult that people take seriously. The other piece of this story is that, I mean, so the museum gets looted. Where does the loot end up? It ends up in rich Americans' private collections. So there's looting and it gets surreptitiously shipped to the United States. One of the big buyers is the owner of Hobby Lobby, the Christian craft store chain, who buys like 5,000 pieces of priceless Iraqi artifacts, which he wants to put in something he's building called the Museum of the Bible, right? So there's this just total looting and desecration of Iraq happening by the US at the same time as we're trying to present them as a uniquely destructive people.
I don't have anything to say to that. I just thought it was really good. And yeah.
So there are a few actual art projects that I want to discuss like around that. One of them is not, two of them I think are inspiring, one of them is not. The not so inspiring one, there's this essay by Cecilia Pieri called Can the T-Wall Murals Really Beautify the Fragmented Baghdad? And one of the things that happened in Iraq was after the US invasion, the US distributed aid and political power along sectarian lines. So the US said, we will recognize, Shia and Sunni and Kurdish leaders, and we'll work with them directly. So patronage networks became entirely based on religion and ethnicity, not on political ideology as they had been before in Iraq. So the US really accelerated the division, the sectarian division of Baghdad, and soon there was a civil war that accompanied the insurgency. And to get that under control, what was done was the building of lots of blast walls. So Baghdad became covered with these T-shaped concrete walls that get put up, in front of banks and stuff to prevent a car bomb from getting to them. And they get like neighborhoods get ringed in these. So then, the French and other European embassies begin paying Iraqi artists to paint, murals of Iraqi unity on these. These are, according to the article, not things that the Iraqis would have chosen to paint themselves, but they are, stories of like, let's rebuild Iraq together. Let's look back at our Mesopotamian heritage.
Wait, so let, let me get this straight.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the walls are going up as part of sort of an artificial intensification of sectarian divisions
Yeah.
in Iraq.
Yes.
And then those blast walls, which are inscribing into the built environment this artificial sectarian division, are then decorated with images of unity across sectarian lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
And but the funny thing is, so one is not what the artist would paint themselves. And she has quotes from artists saying like, there's no personal expression here. Like this is like what the new regime is doing.
Right. This is a form of propaganda art that I'm collecting a paycheck for.
Yeah. But the other thing that happens is that because these T-walls are part of the US-led securitization effort, they move them around as securitization requires. So the murals very quickly get mixed up, right? So you have these sort of like
Oh,
incomprehensible, like the murals quickly become incomprehensible and slammed together in incongruous ways, which
mhm.
instead of creating like these paintings of unity, like, oh, we're all here together, they just highlight the jumbledness and disorder of life that the US invasion is promoting.
Wow. I'm just imagining what it would be like to look at those jumbled murals every day. Like what a sense of utter confusion and chaos. You already live in this city that has been turned on its head from what it was like only a few years before. And then that sense of, yeah, just brokenness, right? The way that that sense of brokenness is reflected to you not just through the blast walls themselves, but also by the images on them. There's something so painful about that.
Yeah. So, in a more hopeful-ish vein, I did want to share the work of two artists
Yeah,
who,
please, I need some hope right now.
yeah. So this is the artist Michael Rakowitz talking about the practice that he developed in the wake of. He's an Iraqi American Jewish artist who developed this practice in response to the U.S. war on terror and also ISIS. So the two of them together, the U.S. military and ISIS, in a certain way collaborated to destroy a lot of Iraq's most valuable archaeological heritage. And so he is responding to that here.
One ongoing work for over 10 years now has been The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, wherein I, along with a team of assistants, reconstruct the more than 7,000 artifacts that were looted from the Iraq Museum, and also archaeological sites that have now been destroyed by different militant groups like ISIS. When I was asked by the City of London to submit a proposal, I looked at the blueprints of the fourth plinth, and it was 14 feet long. And at that time, I'd been researching the Lamassu that stood at the entrance of the Nergal Gate in Nineveh, which had been destroyed the previous year. And that was 14 feet long, and so immediately I saw it as being almost made for it. And so this one stands outside, looking back towards Nineveh, with its wings raised, hoping to return one day in the future. The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist is about not necessarily replacing what's gone, but looking at the measurements of each of those objects and reconstructing them using the materials of cultural visibility that one finds throughout the United States where there are Arab populations. The Lamassu is being reconstructed not of papier-mâché the way that most of them are, but using the tins of Iraqi date syrup, which I have here in my studio. I hope all my work in the future becomes obsolete. If I never have to reconstruct an artifact, it will mean that all of them have somehow turned up. I'm an optimist, but I'm also not quite as naive to think that that's going to happen. But that's kind of the implied challenge in my work. I can't make other things right now because these things that have disappeared kind of need their ghost.
Okay, he nearly made me cry at the end. That's beautifully explained. The idea that these things need their ghost still is so powerful to me. I I thought that the Lamassu that he created for London was really interesting because London is the home of so much looted art, right?
Right.
It's, famously, there are all of these controversies attendant on the art that is warehoused in the British Museum and displayed in the British Museum for it and other museums too, but that's the one that I think attracts the most visible controversies. And the idea of building this replica from what is basically like so there are pieces of these artworks that are made from like yeah items that Iraqis living abroad consume to feel closer to home, but you can also see, for instance, bits of cardboard and bits of newspaper in the reconstructed artifacts.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that cardboard and newspaper might be coming right from culturally relevant newspapers, for instance. I'm not totally sure about that, but not to be dismissive of the newspaper and the cardboard, but this is in some ways trash, right? It's a
Oh
recyclable
yeah.
material, right? And I don't know, I love the idea of like, yeah, London can have its own Lasaru, but it's going to be made of trash. And it's not going to be looking inward at the heart of the British Empire. It's going to be looking outward toward Nineveh. It's just
Yeah.
like, it's great art for London, but it's also like disart for London.
I mean, I think the monuments that he's recreating, you get to see them in that video. But one of the things that I think is quite powerful about them is that they insist on the visibility of these ghosts in American and British space, not necessarily as an accusation, at least that's not how he phrases it, but a kind of demand to acknowledge that this harm is there, this presence is there. And it is quite the artworks are quite beautiful in themselves.
And, the other cool thing about these reconstructions is that they come across as very meticulous, right? When
Hmm.
you look at the photo of the original and the reconstruction side by side, right? They're, obviously they look different, right? They don't look like archaeological, like they don't look old, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of their geometry, their volume, like the way that they fill space, they are very, what's the word? They're very faithful
Yeah.
reconstructions. And yeah, there's something so just like I don't know, they're almost more alive as reconstructions than as archaeological remains, right? I I'm not sure if this is the case specifically for the archaeology of the Fertile Crescent, but a problem with a lot of archaeological remains is that paint pigments lose their potency over time,
Hmm.
right? And so we see these very faded, washed out colors, and we tend to imagine that the monuments of the past were just like very light on the color. And in fact, a lot of them were incredibly gaudy, right? Just these really vivid colors. And I like that in these reconstructions, you get that sense of vividness back a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, they are really vibrant. And I mean, I think the other thing about archaeological finds, this is not to diminish them in any way, but like they get displayed in museums and they're often presented at a kind of remove. And so this effort to sort of force them into public space as living objects, I do think he is breathing a certain kind of life into them, making them piece of social interaction and a yeah, that he is giving them activity in ways that they may not have had for quite some time. So the other artist that I wanted to mention, and I think it's great that you talked about Michael Rakowitz putting Iraq's trash on Britain's doorstep, because that's actually what this other artist did. So this is the artist Aziz Harara from Afghanistan. And I learned about him in this really excellent article called Junk Empire by Joshua Craze, which I guess Craze spent a lot of time working with Aziz Harara. And basically, what Aziz Harara engages with is the monumental amount of trash which the American forces left behind in Afghanistan as they evacuated. Because there's trash everywhere, and some of it gets sold in markets, but some of it is total refuse. And you can trace, so one of the things Harara does is trace how it gets in, or how these different objects got to Afghanistan, and it shows like the financial corruption behind the war on terror. So the ways that they, finance different competing, Afghani warlords to do U.S. deliveries, which is a true fact of the invasion. That it really, again, much like in Iraq, the U.S. produced sectarianism. In Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion incentivized warlords to sort of extract tolls from the U.S. military apparatus and promoted like military factionalism at a very minute degree. But it also left all of this trash, right? And all sorts of things like totally useless things. There are, pallets of sex toys that this guy digs up. And what he started doing is mailing it back to the US. So His art project,
That's great.
his art project is sending like literal tons of U.S. mess back to the U.S. under the title "Coming Home," and he also like has this like so in getting like wherever the galleries are that accept it, he has them sign a thing it can't be removed from the United States. So it's being sent back to the United States and is required to stay there. It has to remain in America in and has to remain in America in perpetuity and not be exported to Southeast Asia along with most of the US's waste. So it it's
The
great.
repatriation of American trash.
Yeah, and the article says, there is a humorous injunction to coming home, which addresses the occupiers. This is your shit. Take ownership of it. You must reckon with the material consequences of your actions. So
Love that.
I love it too. It's a fun little project, but I mean also a very serious one. But I think both of these pieces are interesting because in a very different way from Al Jazeera, but they force the visual field that's created in the countries occupied by the war on terror back into the U.S. center and demand that we look at what we do.
Right. There's almost this origami type of quality to the aesthetic field of the war on terror, where actually I'm very bad at folding origami, so maybe this is an incorrect description of how.
I've gotten really good at it lately.
Oh, so you can tell me then if I'm misunderstanding maybe how origami works as three-dimensional geometry. But what I'm thinking about is that there's this interior to the folds, right, that looks one particular way, and an exterior set of angles that looks a very different way, right? And
Hmm.
there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the facets of the angles that you see on the exterior of the origami, as like if you were to somehow turn it inside out, it wouldn't just look like an inside out version of what you were able to see before. It would look totally different, right? And there's something about the war on terror aesthetics that seems to me to work similarly, where we have these exterior dimensions that are visible to us in the country that launched the war on terror, that look a particular way, and it looks like one coherent thing. And then there's all of the shit that got, this is where the metaphor breaks down a little bit, but like there's all this folding and manipulation that happens on the other side of what we see in the US that doesn't look just like the perfect pair part of
No.
how we've experienced the war on terror. It looks confusing and fragmented, and it is many contradictory things. And I think that that's one of the things that you've really helped me to reckon with in this conversation is okay, the trash project of mailing the trash back to the US, Michael Rakowitz's work, Al Jazeera's broadcasts, all of these are different dimensions of that origami project that we see the other end of in the United States.
Yeah. And to put like a point on that, that's definitely something we've been thinking about. Going back to that quote that we opened with about the little boy who no longer loves blue skies because of the drones, and also Runak Kapadia's description or use of that to describe a quote unquote new imperial sensorium. And the idea of crafting a sensorium was interesting to us. But I think we were really interested in how, as you're saying, the sensorium takes a different shape inside the US. There is a sensorium produced inside the US, a way of viewing the world that is deliberately created. But there's something very different created abroad on the impacts of our imperial actions. And I think bringing those together tears some of that terrorist imperium apart.
Yes. And I think, for instance, that phrase blue skies from the 6-year-old's testimony in US Congress in some ways is a really useful pivot point for thinking about how this sensorium feels and how it operates in the US and how it feels and operates in the places where the war on terror was actually prosecuted. So, it's almost become, I think, a cliche at this point to talk about how 9/11 was this perfect September day with these blue skies. And when Americans remember the blue skies of 9/11, part of what they're gesturing at is the sense of violation that came from having this perfect day turn into a day of terror, right? That
Right.
of all days, this perfect day would be the one that would be the trauma. And that sense of violation is in turn used to justify the prosecution of the war on terror, right? It's
Yeah.
like, well, Americans felt bad and they felt afraid and they felt vulnerable. And therefore that those feelings justify any sort of lashing out through war that America would want to do, because how can it be that Americans could ever feel unsafe, right? And so to think about, you know, it's not a uniquely American thing to feel happy when the skies are blue and for that to make you feel cheerful, and for it to feel shocking and terrifying when an act of violence takes that beautiful day and turns it into a day of horrors. And yet, part of the way that this war on terror sensorium operates is that for Americans, that sense of violation and wrongness to the blue sky being the site of violence, that is a precious thing that, needs to be protected through violence onto others, right? That American
Yeah.
innocence needs to somehow be protected. But the 6-year-old, he just needs to get used to hating blue skies and
Right.
loving gray skies.
Right. There's no American imagination where it justifies lashing back, right? Where the things that allow
Right.
us to lash out that justify all the violence. And in fact, we don't even have to acknowledge the violence because it's justified by what's already happened to us.
Hmm.
And any acknowledgement of that sentiment becomes, terrorist beyond the pale to say like this is the sort of thing that that leads people to fight back, right? Like that leads to insurgencies is is seen as like so disruptive and beyond the pale that I mean they kill people for saying it.
Yeah. Right. This is how Al Jazeera becomes the Al Qaeda network.
Yeah. So yeah, in solidarity with Baghdad and Afghanistan and all of the countries where the U.S. has waged unaccountable drone wars against civilians, this is bad art. Standing up for good art, good art that pushes back against the world of terror that our masters are creating. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock,
I'm Marielle Grushko.
and you've been listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. Thanks so much for hanging with us through a somewhat depressing episode. Please do tell your friends, like, listen, subscribe, do all of those things, and we will look forward to talking to you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you. We'll see you next time to talk about the ways in which 9/11 is memorialized in the United States, including a very bizarre U2 performance at the Super Bowl.
Yeah, we're gonna look at some weird ads and performances and whatnot. We're looking forward to it. So, bye everybody.
Bye.